Well, the message of this passage might be simple. Show care to those who need it. It is set against a backdrop fraught with tensions and troubles, and following the message seems to be increasingly complicated. In the Gospel of Matthew, today's passage comes right before the Passion narrative. Well, Jesus is anticipating his suffering and death. This parable is the last in a very long series of parables that Jesus was teaching while in Jerusalem. He had entered Jerusalem in triumph, raised just a bit of trouble in the temple, and then he spent a lot of time teaching. The first section of teaching was to the crowds and the authorities, and he spent a lot of time criticizing the unethical aspects of the leadership. The second section of teaching occurred when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives and the disciples came to him privately. Today's reading takes place at the end of this second section of teaching, which means that the lesson in it was meant for his closest followers. I'd like to think that this lesson was intended to stop them from falling into the same decadence and callousness that Jesus saw in the leadership within Jerusalem. Before this parable, Jesus had made many criticisms of the leadership, the temple leadership, the priests, the high priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Jesus was criticizing them for making grand displays of piety while neglecting justice, mercy, and faith. Jesus was criticizing their hypocrisy, was criticizing their way of locking people out of the kingdom of heaven by setting standards that they themselves couldn't live up to. So with impending suffering and death, I'd like to think that Jesus is looking at this leadership. He's seeing how they also are following something. And he's seeing the dedication of his own followers, possibly seeing the power that they could have as leaders of faith. And he's trying to offer them something to protect them from themselves, something to protect them from becoming the self-serving leadership that he was frustrated with. But that makes this passage a mirror for critical reflection on discipleship. And if it is a mirror, the reflection is not always pleasant. I'm very, very sorry to say that at times, Christianity has behaved in the very way that Jesus feared. We have a long history of crusades, numerous wars, religious inquisitions, witch hunts, racial segregations, apartheid, anti-Semitism. All of these have involved people who tried to use the banner of Christianity to promote them. Yet all of these completely fail to live up to what Jesus taught in today's passage. And those are just some of the more obvious examples of where Christians have failed to live up to Jesus' expectations. For all the advances we have made in science, politics, philosophy, society, and technology, for all of that progress, you would think that caring for those who need it would have become more simple. But instead, it seems to have become far more complicated. 200 years ago, slavery was the great sin that plagued the world. After various countries abolished it, racial segregation was the problem, whether it was the segregation of African Americans or the Holocaust of Jewish people, or forcing indigenous people into residential schools. These are easier to understand as evil, but racism persists, as do the movements that combat it, from Black Lives Matter to defund the police to avoiding cultural appropriation. The work of combating racism is unfinished. And as the work progresses, the examples we see seem far more insidious or complicated. The same could be said with gender issues. 100 years ago, women fought for the right to vote. 60 years ago, birth control enabled women to have more choice over their own bodies. But the work is unfinished and has only expanded into recent years to include the glass ceiling, systematic sexism, issues faced by the LGBT plus community, and the Me Too movement. At my very core, I believe that we must continue to root out these various injustices. But there are also times when I feel frustrated, because it might mean adjusting something that I was comfortable with, or acknowledging my own culpability, despite priding myself on loving justice. Just when I thought I knew how to feed the hungry, I discover I've set off an allergy. Just when I thought I knew how to clothe the naked, I discover that I've given them a garment that is taboo to their own culture. Just when I thought I knew how to comfort those in a prison of depression, I discover that I've hit a trigger and set them into a relapse. Our world seems increasingly complicated, but we need to keep critically examining it. We cannot keep people in prisons of depression. We cannot keep clothing people in ways that strip them of their dignity. We cannot keep feeding people food that they are allergic to. And we cannot continue to tolerate people being enslaved by discrimination, no matter how insidious, systematic, or subtle. But with all this trouble, one might ask, where is the hope? Well, I think Mark Twain had a bit of wisdom here. Heaven is by favor. If it were by merit, your dog would go in, and we would stay out. Earlier, I mentioned that this passage engages with a very old debate in the history of the church, the debate between grace and works. In something of a paradox, that great controversy ends up shining a light of grace on our trouble here. This great controversy came to a head in the 5th century and was later known as the Pelagian controversy. Pelagius not only taught that the individual human was entirely responsible for their behavior, but that the individual was capable of and obliged to live a life completely free of sin, a life of complete ethical perfection. Well, St. Augustine argued something of the opposite, that God's grace was ever present in the good works of humans. And if arguing wasn't enough for Augustine, he also felt it necessary to write an entire autobiography apologizing for all of the mistakes in his life. Considering the stereotype of Canadians as having a tendency to over-apologize, I've wondered at times if maybe Augustine should have been picked as the patron saint of Canada. Now, another thing I felt uncomfortable of when I was looking at this controversy was the word of heresy. It's a very harsh, hard, and seemingly narrow word. Then I was taught to think of it as like a goalpost. A goalpost, in and of itself, is also very narrow, and if, like me, you've ever run into one, then you know it's very hard. But the game takes place between the goalposts and is not limited to the goalpost. When the church looked at Pelagianism as a heresy, it was saying, here the game has gone out of bounds. Specifically, it was saying that the idea that humans are expected to be ethically perfect is out of bounds. However, the responsibility to try to behave ethically is still very much in the game. Augustine's theology of grace was just acknowledging that we're not always going to get it right. It acknowledges that God's redeeming grace is present with us when we get things right, and it is there to assist us through the struggle and the trouble. So, paradoxically, I find that this great controversy actually helps me to see grace at the root of this passage, or rather, to keep this passage rooted in grace. Where today's passage might push us to strive for ethical behavior, for ethical perfection, Pelagianism just pulls us back from getting too critical of ourselves and from grouping each other with the goats. There's also something very relevant to our contemporary value of multiculturalism. I believe that the phrase, "the least of these," does not exclude any human in need. It does not exclude by race or by creed. And the same goes for the righteous. They asked the Lord, "When was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food?" And Jesus considers them righteous because they gave care to those who need it. I'd like to think that this means those who follow other creeds have fulfilled the teachings of Jesus and know Jesus if they have cared for others. It means that when a rabbi showed me hospitality, when she taught me about her own faith, when she hosted me at a Shabbat meal, she was fulfilling what Jesus expected of us Christians. It means that when an atheist spends great portions of their free time volunteering at a soup kitchen or other community service programs to help those in need, they are fulfilling what Jesus expects of us Christians. Now, when I say they are fulfilling what Jesus expects of us, I'm trying to be very careful with my words, because here's where showing love also gets a bit complicated in today's multicultural world. If I'm to respect other cultures and faiths, I might say that when a person has shown care and love, they have fulfilled what Jesus expects of us. But I need to respect that they are being informed by their own beliefs. As a Christian, I and all of us try to root our ethical understanding in the story and in the teaching of Jesus. We believe that this is how we encounter Jesus. But whether or not the rabbi was good while hosting me, that is measured by the teachings of her own faith. The atheist gets to judge their actions in accordance with whichever ethical systems they follow. The text just implies that when we humans show care for one another, we've measured up to what Jesus is expecting of us. It offers the beginning of an interfaith respect, but there are times I wish it could go further. When I studied Christian and Muslim relations, I was taught that there are verses in the Quran which show respect for and demand protect for people of the book. This term, people of the book, extends beyond Muslims to Christians and Jews. The term people of the book explicitly recognizes that there are different pathways to learning moral behavior and that they are of value. Today's text is very specific about the need to show care for those who need it, but I think a bit of interpretation is sometimes required to demonstrate that this care is to span differences in faith, religion, and culture. I'm not saying that being a Christian isn't important. Christianity and its Anglican iteration are exceptionally important to me and to my life. Following the Christian story is how I have learned ways for caring for others. It's where I've learned about values such as duty, sacrifice, and love. There are aspects of the Christian church that I dearly love, parts of its art, its culture, figures in its history who have reflected Christ's love. The tension behind today's passage isn't telling us to abandon those parts of the church. It's just telling us that we need to make sure they don't become what Jesus said of the scribes and Pharisees, that they make heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others. So although Jesus speaks this text while witnessing horrible injustice and in anticipation of great suffering, and although our world seems to be ever increasing in complexity, we can indeed return to that very simple message, that in loving and caring for those who need it, we fulfill Jesus' expectations. Loving and caring for others matters, regardless of the complexity. In answering this, heaven is indeed by favor, not by merit. So you will be joining your dog. In fulfilling this command to care and love your neighbor, you will help to usher in the reign of Christ. Amen.